I am your host. Let's begin our journey.
It was the silence that struck me first, not the comfortable, sleepy hush that settles over a house on Christmas Eve, but a silence with edges, sharp, unnatural, as though someone had pressed a palm over the mouth of the world and commanded it not to breathe. Outside, snow fell with patient determination, whitening the hedges and smoothing the gravel drive into a pale ribbon that vanished into the dark. Inside, Ashcroft Manor glowed with lamplight and the scent of pine, wax, and something sweetly spiced drifting up from the kitchens. Poirot, as usual, had strong feelings about the placement of decorations. The garland, Hastings, look! It droops like a moustache that has lost its pride. I laughed, half from the absurdity of it, and half because the house was in such a festive mood that laughter felt like the only reasonable response. Lady Ashcroft, a thin woman with an anxious smile, had insisted that Poirot and I must come. Just a quiet Christmas, she had written. Only the family and one or two friends. In the way of wealthy households, one or two had become an entire caste. There was Sir Lionel Ashcroft himself, master of the house, a man whose charm had the polished sheen of a practiced coin. He greeted us with warmth, but his eyes flicked past us, measuring the room as if tallying risks. Beside him hovered his daughter, Miss Celeste Ashcroft. Young, luminous and tightly strung, the sort of beauty that seemed to conceal sleepless nights behind perfect posture. Near the fireplace stood Major Rupert Vale, a broad-shouldered man with soldierly manners and a gaze that lingered too long on Celeste. At the window, as if preferring the company of the snow to people, was Miss Imogen Price, the Ashcrofts' private secretary, efficient, pale and watchful, with a mouth that looked as though it had been trained never to reveal surprise. And then there was Dr. Edwin Marr, the family's physician, whose geniality was almost excessive, like a bright ribbon tied tight. Finally, a last arrival swept in on a gust of cold air and perfume. Mrs. Verity Crane, Lady Ashcroft's sister, dressed in velvet and confidence, her laughter ringing out a fraction too loudly for a quiet Christmas. Dinner was splendid, as these things are, and yet beneath the clink of cutlery and the sparkle of candlelight, I felt a tension humming, thin as a wire but present all the same. Voices rose and softened in careful patterns. Smiles flashed and vanished. A remark about money became a joke too quickly. A compliment landed like a pin. Poirot noticed everything. He always does. While I occupied myself with carving and polite conversation, he arranged his peas with meticulous care, as though the order on his plate might impose order on the room. After dinner, we moved to the music room for carols. Celeste played the piano beautifully, though her hands trembled once when Sir Lionel stepped behind her chair. Lady Ashcroft insisted on Silent Night, and someone, Verity I think, said it suited the house. It was during the second verse that the door to the corridor opened and the butler, Merrick, appeared. He did not clear his throat. He did not announce himself. He simply stood there, very straight, very white, as though the house had turned to ice and only he had realized it. "My lady," he said, and even his voice sounded wrong, flattened by shock. "Sir Lionel, he is in the study." Lady Ashcroft rose halfway, then sat again, one hand flying to her throat as if the air had grown thin. "In the study?" Dr. Marr echoed, already stepping forward. Merrick's eyes flicked to Poirot, perhaps because Poirot's calm is a strange kind of authority. "He is not responding, sir. We went in a cluster, our slippers and polished shoes muffled by rugs, down the corridor toward the study." The door stood ajar. The Christmas tree lights in the hall blinked cheerfully, indifferent. Sir Lionel lay on the Persian carpet beside his desk, one arm bent at an awkward angle. His face had a curious stillness, not contorted with pain, not marked by struggle, simply fixed, as if he had been interrupted mid-thought and had never resumed it. A glass lay on its side near the hearthrug, a dark stain spreading slowly into the pile. Poirot did not rush, he did not kneel at once. He looked, at the angle of the body, at the placement of the glass, at the desk with its neat stacks, at the fire that burned a little too brightly. Dr. Marr moved first, fingers at Sir Lionel's neck. He looked up, and the room seemed to tilt. "He's dead." Celeste gave a small sound, not a scream, but something quieter, like a breath cut short. Lady Ashcroft swayed, Verity caught her, and Major Vale took one step forward as if to do something heroic and then stopped, helpless. Poirot very gently reached out and closed the study door behind us. The click sounded loud as a gunshot in the hush. "Mes amis," he said softly, and his eyes swept the room like a lantern moving across dark water. "We will keep our composure, because someone among us has already lost theirs." Snow continued to fall as though nothing of consequence had occurred, thickening the quiet outside Ashcroft Manor. Inside, however, the air had changed. It pressed close, heavy with unspoken thoughts, and every movement sounded too loud. Someone had turned off the piano lamp, leaving the music room dim, but the study glowed harshly under its single ceiling light, exposing everything without mercy. Poirot positioned himself carefully near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, his posture immaculate despite the disorder before us. He did not touch the body again, nor did he allow anyone else to do so. His authority asserted itself without a raised voice or a dramatic gesture. "We will wait for the police," Lady Ashcroft said faintly, clinging to her sister's arm. This is dreadful. Christmas Eve." "Oui, madame," Poirot replied gently. "But until they arrive, it is essential that no one leaves this house, and that we all speak with honesty. Disorder, you see, is the great ally of deception." Major Vale bristled. "Are you suggesting one of us did this?" Poirot inclined his head. "I am suggesting nothing. I am observing everything." Dr. Marr cleared his throat, attempting to restore some sense of normality. Sir Lionel suffered from heart strain. It could have been sudden. That glass, perhaps brandy. Poirot's eyes flicked briefly to him. Perhaps. And yet the glass is overturned, not dropped. That is a small distinction, but small distinctions are often decisive. Miss Imogen Price stood very straight near the door, hands folded at her waist. "Sir Lionel was in good spirits this evening," she said quietly. "He was working earlier, yes, but not distressed." "Earlier?" Poirot repeated softly. "You saw him earlier tonight, mademoiselle?" "Yes, around 7:30. He asked me to bring him some correspondence. He dismissed me almost at once." "And after that?" "I did not see him again." Mrs. Crane gave a short, brittle laugh. Lionel was always dismissing people. "That doesn't mean anything. He liked to be alone when he brooded." "Brooded?" Poirot asked. She lifted one shoulder elegantly. "Money, family matters, the usual. He had been irritable these past weeks." Celeste Ashcroft, who had not yet spoken, suddenly looked up. "That isn't fair, Aunt Verity." Verity's eyes narrowed. "Isn't it? Your father wasn't exactly easy to live with, my dear." Poirot watched the exchange with interest, noting the slight tightening of Celeste's jaw and the way her fingers twisted together in her lap. "And you, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "when did you last see your father alive?" Celeste swallowed. "Before dinner. He wished me a Merry Christmas. He kissed my cheek." Her voice wavered. "He said we would talk later." Major Vale shifted his weight. "I saw Sir Lionel in the corridor after dinner. He was going to study." "At what time?" Poirot asked. "Just after 8, I believe." "And you did not accompany him?" "No. I joined the others in the drawing room." Poirot nodded and turned slightly, as though rearranging the room in his mind. "This house is large, but tonight it is very full. A closed circle, yes? No strangers, no chance intruders." The butler Merrick, who had been standing silently near the wall, spoke. "All exterior doors were locked for the evening, sir, as per Christmas instructions." "Excellent," Poirot murmured. "Order is a comfort." Lady Ashcroft suddenly drew herself upright. "Monsieur Poirot, are you truly telling us that one of our guests, or family, has murdered my husband?" Poirot met her gaze steadily. "Madam, I am saying only this. Sir Lionel did not die alone. Whether by intention or by fear, someone shared his final moments, and that person is still in this house." Silence followed, deeper than before. The fire crackled. Somewhere upstairs a clock chimed the quarter hour, each note landing like a measured accusation. Poirot adjusted his cuffs with care. "Until the police arrive, I will ask you all to remain available. We will speak again one by one. For now, I advise you to be calm. Panic makes people careless." As we left the study and gathered once more in the drawing room, I could not shake the feeling that Christmas itself had been suspended, held in an uneasy pause, while Poirot's little grey cells began, inexorably, to tighten their grip around the truth. The wait for the police stretched on, lengthened by the snow that continued to thicken the roads beyond the manor. In that interval, Poirot began what he later described as the gentle ordering of chaos. One by one he invited us into the smaller morning room, a space warmed by a coal fire and scented faintly with beeswax polish. It was here, away from the solemn presence of the study, that he commenced his first interviews. Mrs. Crane went first. She entered with her chin lifted, grief carefully arranged like her velvet shawl. Poirot offered her a chair and waited until she was settled before speaking. "You and Sir Lionel," he began mildly, "you were close, no?" She smiled thinly. "Close enough to be family. He was my brother-in-law, after all. And yet you spoke of irritation, of brooding." She waved a gloved hand. He was under pressure. Financial decisions, old investments resurfacing. He disliked interference. "Interference from whom, madame?" Her eyes flickered, just for an instant. "From anyone who disagreed with him." Poirot thanked her and made a small note. When she left, Miss Price entered at once, precise as a clock striking its hour. "You are very loyal," Poirot observed, gesturing for her to sit. "You have served Sir Lionel for many years." "7, she replied. "I owe him a lot." "Did you owe him gratitude or silence?" She stiffened. "I don't understand." Poirot's tone remained courteous. "You handled his correspondence. You knew his affairs. Did you know of anything that troubled him greatly of late?" Miss Price hesitated, then spoke carefully. "There were letters, anonymous ones. They upset him." "What sort of letters? Accusations? Threats, perhaps? He never showed them to me fully." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And this evening, did he receive such a letter?" "I cannot say," she replied. "He locked his desk before dinner. Next came Major Vale, who paced the room before sitting, as though unused to being questioned rather than questioning." "You admired Sir Lionel," Poirot suggested. "I respected him," Vale said. "He was formidable." "And your feelings for his daughter?" Vale flushed. "Celeste is dear to me. Sir Lionel did not approve. Disapproval can be dangerous," Poirot remarked lightly. "Did you argue with him?" "Not tonight," Vale said quickly. "We had words last week, yes, but nothing more." Celeste herself arrived last, pale but composed. Poirot softened visibly with her, offering tea and allowing a moment's silence before speaking. "Your father promised to speak with you later," he said. "About what, mademoiselle?" Her eyes filled but did not spill. "About my future. He wished me to remain here. I wished to leave. With Major Vale. And this caused anger?" "Yes," she whispered. "But not hatred." Poirot nodded and dismissed her gently. At last Dr. Marr took the chair, his smile a shade too practiced. "You attended Sir Lionel medically," Poirot said. "Did you note anything unusual of late?" "Stress," Marr replied. "High blood pressure. Nothing fatal. And the drink by the fireplace?" "Brandy, I should think." Poirot tilted his head. "You should think? You did not examine it." Marr shifted. There was no need. By the time the police finally arrived, stamping snow from their boots and bringing the outside world crashing back into the house, Poirot had arranged his impressions neatly, like cards in a hand. No accusation yet, no grand theory. Only a quiet certainty that every person he had spoken to had withheld something. As the inspector took charge of the body and sealed the study, Poirot leaned toward me and murmured, "You see, Hastings, the truth does not shout, it whispers, and tonight everyone is whispering something different." The house settled into a strained quiet once the police had taken their preliminary statements and withdrawn to examine the study more thoroughly. Snow muffled the outside world, sealing Ashcroft Manor into its own small universe, where every creak of the floorboards sounded like a confession trying to escape. Poirot, apparently undisturbed by fatigue or the lateness of the hour, requested that the household resume as natural a rhythm as possible. Tea was brought, lamps were adjusted, the chairs were straightened. Order, as he often said, calmed the nerves and loosened the tongue. Inspector Dawkins, a solid man with sensible boots and a manner that favoured practicality over nuance, joined Poirot and me near the drawing-room window. "At present," he said, consulting his notebook, "we're treating this as a suspicious death with no clear sign of forced entry. No weapon has been found beyond the glass, which contained traces of something bitter. Poison," Poirot murmured. "Or something intended to resemble it." Dawkins frowned. "You're thinking of murder, then?"
"I am thinking," Poirot replied mildly, "that Sir Lionel's death was not convenient, and deaths that are inconvenient are rarely accidental." While the inspector returned to his duties, Poirot asked that the household staff be brought in quietly, one at a time. Merrick the butler spoke first, his voice steady but his hands betraying him. "Sir Lionel was particular tonight," Merrick said. "He asked me twice whether the doors were secured. He did not usually concern himself with such matters." "And did he receive visitors in his study after dinner?" Poirot asked. "No, sir. At least, none announced." Poirot thanked him and turned next to the maid, Clara, whose eyes darted nervously. "I brought a tray to the study around 8, she said. "Sir Lionel told me to leave it by the door. He sounded angry." "Angry at whom?" Poirot pressed. She shook her head. "He was alone." "Was he?" Poirot asked softly, but Clara was already retreating, frightened by the weight of her own words. When the staff had gone, Poirot stood very still, his gaze fixed on the Christmas tree. "You observe, Hastings," he said, "how anger hangs in the air like perfume. One need not see the wearer to know it is there." I nodded, though I felt less certain than he sounded. Late in the evening, Inspector Dawkins returned with preliminary findings. The cause of death was poisoning, he confirmed, fast-acting, likely administered shortly before death. No sign of struggle. "That is curious," Poirot said. "If Sir Lionel was angry, as we are told, anger often invites confrontation." Dawkins shrugged. "Could have trusted the wrong person." "Just so," Poirot agreed. Lady Ashcroft sent word that she wished to retire, overcome by fatigue. Mrs. Crane accompanied her, casting one last calculating glance around the room. Celeste withdrew upstairs, supported by Major Vale, whose jaw was clenched as if he were biting back something sharp. Only Miss Price lingered, gathering papers from a side table. "You will sleep tonight, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked her. She hesitated. "I doubt it." "Then you and I are alike," Poirot said kindly. At last Poirot and I were alone. The fire had burned low, and shadows stretched long across the carpet. "The inspector believes we have our murderer among the family," I said. "The wife, perhaps, or the sister." Poirot shook his head slowly. "They are too obvious, Hastings. Grief, greed, resentment, these are the masks everyone expects. But the true criminal often hides behind usefulness, behind service, behind the assumption that they would never risk everything." He rose and walked toward the corridor leading to the study, stopping just short of the sealed door. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I shall begin the real work. Tonight was merely the overture." As I followed him upstairs, the house seemed to listen, as though aware that the game had truly begun, and that Christmas at Ashcroft Manor would never again be remembered for its carols or its snow. Morning arrived reluctantly, a pale light filtering through the snow-clouded windows, as though the day itself were unsure whether it wished to witness what had occurred in the night. The house stirred slowly, footsteps echoed in distant corridors, doors opened and closed with exaggerated care, and voices remained subdued, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the dead. Poirot was already awake when I joined him in the breakfast room. He sat perfectly composed, his napkin folded with military precision, regarding a boiled egg as though it were a philosophical problem. "You did not sleep," I said. "Mais non," he replied calmly. "Sleep is for those whose minds are at rest." Inspector Dawkins arrived shortly after, cheeks reddened by the cold and irritation. "We've identified the poison," he announced. "Digitalis, extracted, concentrated. Not something one comes across by accident." Poirot inclined his head. "And who, Inspector, would have access to such a substance?" Dawkins consulted his notes. "Dr. Marr, naturally. He keeps medications. Possibly Miss Price. She manages supplies.
And Lady Ashcroft has a greenhouse. Foxgloves grow there. Ah, Poirot murmured, already the net tightens. Dr. Marr was summoned and arrived with professional composure. He admitted readily that digitalis was among his medical stores, but insisted nothing was missing. And I would never administer it casually, he said. The dosage must be precise. Yet someone was precise, Poirot observed. Too precise. Miss Price was questioned next. She acknowledged ordering household medicines but denied handling anything stronger than aspirin. Lady Ashcroft, pale and exhausted, seemed genuinely shocked to learn of the poison's origin, though she admitted foxglove had grown freely in the garden for years. By midday, Inspector Dawkins appeared satisfied. The doctor had the means, he said bluntly, and the opportunity. He examined the body first. Poirot did not contradict him, which surprised me. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "It is reasonable, Inspector, very reasonable." Dr. Marr was asked to remain available. His smile thinned, but he complied. As the afternoon wore on, tension shifted subtly. Servants whispered, doors were watched, and in the drawing-room I observed Celeste watching Dr. Marr with an intensity that bordered on accusation. Poirot noticed too. He leaned toward me. "Observe how suspicion moves, Hastings. Like a cat, it always seeks the warmest place." Later, Poirot requested a private word with Dr. Marr in the conservatory. Through the glass I could see the doctor's gestures grow sharper, his voice raised once. Poirot, by contrast, remained serenely still. When they emerged, Dr. Marr looked shaken. "What did you say to him?" I asked. "I suggested," Poirot replied mildly, "that truth is lighter than lies, and therefore easier to carry." Shortly after, Inspector Dawkins announced his intention to place Dr. Marr under provisional arrest. The decision rippled through the house like a sharp intake of breath. Lady Ashcroft wept openly. Miss Price looked faint. Major Vale swore under his breath. Celeste, however, stood very still, her expression unreadable. That evening, as Dr. Marr was escorted upstairs under supervision, Poirot remained in the drawing-room, examining the mantelpiece ornaments with unnecessary care. "Do you agree with the inspector?" I asked cautiously. Poirot smiled without humour. "Non, but sometimes, Hastings, it is useful to let the wrong conclusion walk a little way ahead. It reveals who is following." As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Crane appeared in the doorway. "I heard," she said softly. "The doctor." "Yes," Poirot replied. "It must be a relief." Her eyes flickered. "Relief is a strange word." "Is it?" Poirot asked gently. "I find people choose their words with great care when they fear being overheard, even by themselves." She did not reply, but her hands tightened around the edge of the doorframe before she withdrew. That night, Poirot stood once more outside the study door, now sealed with official tape. He regarded it as one might a chessboard midway through a match. "The false lead has been accepted," he said quietly. "Now, Hastings, watch very closely. The murderer will soon make a mistake. They always do." The house reacted almost immediately to the inspector's decision, though not in any way that could be recorded in a notebook. The reaction was emotional rather than practical, and Poirot watched it unfold with the attentiveness of a botanist observing a rare plant begin to wilt. People adjusted their behavior without realizing they were doing so. Voices grew more careful, movements became calculated, relief, guilt, and fear each revealed themselves in subtle, distinct ways. Dr. Marr was confined to his room under supervision, and the atmosphere at Ashcroft Manor shifted into something resembling uneasy truce. Inspector Dawkins believed he had done well. The poison, the medical access, the opportunity, everything fit neatly. Poirot, however, showed no sign of satisfaction. Instead, he began what he cheerfully referred to as a little exercise in psychology. He announced, quite casually at luncheon, that the police would likely conclude their work within 24 hours. "Once the formalities are complete," he said, stirring his soup with unnecessary precision, "life may resume its normal course. Papers will be signed, plans resumed, futures decided." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Crane paused with her spoon halfway to her lips. Major Vale glanced instinctively toward Celeste. Miss Price lowered her eyes too quickly. Only Lady Ashcroft appeared genuinely confused, as though the concept of a future had temporarily lost all meaning for her. Later that afternoon, Poirot asked Celeste to walk with him in the gallery overlooking the snow-covered gardens. She agreed, though her tension was evident. "You are very quiet today, mademoiselle," Poirot observed. "I am trying to be strong," she replied. "Everyone expects it." "Strength," Poirot said gently, "often looks like silence. But silence can be dangerous." She stopped walking. "You don't believe Dr. Marr did it?" "No," Poirot said simply. Relief flickered across her face, followed by fear. "Then, someone else? Someone who is watching very carefully to see what you will do next." That evening, Poirot changed his approach. He requested that everyone gather informally in the drawing-room after supper, not for questioning, but for what he described as a necessary clarification. Inspector Dawkins, skeptical but curious, agreed to observe. Poirot spoke pleasantly, almost conversationally. "It has occurred to me," he said, "that Sir Lionel's death may not have been intended to occur on Christmas Eve at all." The room stiffened. "Crimes," Poirot continued, "are often planned with great care. But circumstances intervene, a delay, a conversation, a promise to speak later." His eyes rested briefly on Celeste. Mrs. Crane laughed too quickly. "Are you suggesting this was an accident?" "Non," Poirot replied. "I suggest it was premature." That single word, premature, settled like frost. Miss Price excused herself soon after, citing a headache. Poirot noted the time. So did I. Not 10 minutes later, Merrick the butler appeared, pale and shaken. "Monsieur Poirot," he said quietly, "there is something you should see." In the corridor outside the study, one of the tall vases had been moved. Behind it, where the wall met the skirting board, a folded scrap of paper lay half concealed. Inspector Dawkins retrieved it carefully. It was part of a letter, burned at the edges, incomplete but legible enough. "You will ruin us both if you speak tonight." Poirot closed his eyes briefly, as though completing a puzzle already solved. "Who found this?" Dawkins asked. "Mademoiselle Price, sir," Merrick replied. "She rang the bell in some distress." Poirot nodded. "As I hoped." Miss Price was brought back, visibly shaken. "I only meant to tidy," she said. "I didn't know—" "You knew enough," Poirot interrupted gently, "enough to be afraid." Her composure cracked then, just a fraction. Fear rose to the surface, not of accusation, but of exposure. Poirot turned to the inspector. "Now we see movement. When the wrong man is accused, the guilty grow bold. When the end appears near, they act." Inspector Dawkins frowned. "Are you saying Dr. Marr's arrest provoked this?" "I am saying," Poirot replied, "that someone believed the danger had passed." He looked around the room once more, his gaze calm but unyielding. "And that belief, mes amis, is about to cost them everything." Night returned to Ashcroft Manor with an almost theatrical deliberation, as though the house itself wished to witness what would happen next. Snow pressed against the windows in thick, quiet waves, muting sound and distance alike. Lamps were lit earlier than usual, and their reflections trembled in the glass, giving the illusion of movement where none should exist. Poirot remained uncharacteristically visible that evening. He did not retire early, nor did he confine himself to one room. Instead, he drifted, appearing briefly in the drawing-room, then in the hall, later pausing by the foot of the staircase, as though admiring the symmetry of the banister. It was, I realized, quite deliberate. He wished to be seen. Inspector Dawkins took him aside. "You're expecting something." Poirot smiled faintly. "I am expecting a decision." It came sooner than either of us anticipated. Just after 10, when the household had settled into a strained imitation of routine, a sudden crash echoed from the west wing, sharp enough to cut through the quiet like broken glass through silk. A scream followed, not loud, but strangled, abruptly silenced. We ran. The sound had come from the conservatory. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of damp earth and crushed greenery. One of the tall glass panels stood shattered inward, snow blowing through the opening. Beneath the overturned plant stand lay Miss Imogen Price. She was alive. That much was clear at once. Her eyes were open, unfocused, and her breathing came in short, uneven gasps. Blood trickled from a cut along her temple where she had struck the stone floor. Dr. Marr, pale and shaken, was summoned at once. Under supervision, he examined her quickly, Concussion, he said. Shock. She was struck from behind. With what? Inspector Dawkins demanded. Poirot bent down and retrieved a small, heavy object from the floor nearby, a brass paperweight shaped like a classical column. Symbolism, he murmured. Interesting. Miss Price was carried to a sofa and revived enough to speak. Her voice was weak but clear. I knew someone would. Try, she whispered. Poirot leaned close. Try to silence you, mademoiselle? Her eyes flicked toward the doorway, where Mrs. Crane stood very still, one hand pressed to her lips. I found the letter, Miss Price said. I recognized the handwriting, not Sir Lionel's. Whose, then? Dawkins pressed. She swallowed. Mrs. Crane's. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Verity Crane stepped backward as though struck, then straightened, anger flaring. That's absurd, she snapped. You were always dramatic, Imogen. Always imagine yourself as important. Poirot rose slowly. And yet, he said quietly, you were the only one who laughed when I suggested the death was premature. Mrs. Crane's gaze flicked to him. What does that prove? That you knew Sir Lionel planned to speak later that evening, Poirot replied, and that you feared what he would say. Inspector Dawkins moved closer. Mrs. Crane, where were you at 10 o'clock? In my room, she said. Alone. Poirot nodded, and yet the conservatory door from the west corridor was unlocked. Only 2 people use that corridor at night. One is Miss Price, the other is you. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air tight and thin. Miss Price stirred weakly. She argued with him earlier, about trust, about the codicil. That was enough. Lady Ashcroft let out a small cry, and Major Vale swore softly. Poirot did not raise his voice, he did not accuse, he simply let the truth stand where it could be seen. This, he said gently, was the mistake I was waiting for. Inspector Dawkins signalled to a constable. Mrs. Crane stared around the room, disbelief giving way to something colder. You think you've won, she said. You think this proves anything. Poirot met her gaze steadily. It proves desperation, and desperation is never subtle. As Mrs. Crane was escorted away, the house seemed to exhale for the first time since Sir Lionel's death. Miss Price lay back against the cushions, eyes closed now, exhaustion overtaking. Fear. Poirot turned to me quietly. You see, Hastings, when the guilty believe the game is ending without them, they rush to rewrite the final move. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent, but inside Ashcroft Manor, the mystery had just taken its sharpest turn. Morning came brittle and bright. The snow outside hardened into a crust that reflected light like broken glass. The house was quieter now, not from fear but from fatigue. Miss Price slept under watch, Dr. Marr's careful instructions delivered and obeyed, while Mrs. Crane occupied a guest room under constable guard. Her defiance cooled into a rigid silence. Inspector Dawkins believed the case was effectively finished. Poirot did not correct him. Instead, Poirot asked for small, ordinary things. He requested the breakfast tray Sir Lionel had ordered but never touched. He asked to see the wastebasket from the study. He inquired whether the post had been delivered the day before Christmas Eve, and, if so, at what hour. Each question seemed harmless. Taken together, they formed a quiet pressure, like fingers testing the seams of a glove. I found him in the study that afternoon, standing very still before the desk. His reflection doubled faintly in the glass of a framed photograph. He did not look at the photograph. He looked at the space around it. You see, Hastings, he said, everyone looks at what is missing. The glass, the poison, the letter. But what is present is often more revealing. He asked me to fetch Miss Price's handbag from her room. When I returned, he examined it without opening it, weighing it in his hands as one might a melon. Then he smiled just slightly and handed it back. She carries her life with care, he said, everything in its place. He next asked to see Sir Lionel's watch. Inspector Dawkins produced it readily, proud of his thoroughness. Poirot turned it over, peered at the clasp, and then set it beside the desk clock. The watch stopped, the inspector said, at the time of death. Poirot nodded. Oui. And yet the clock on the mantelpiece did not. Nor did the clock in the hall, nor the one in the kitchen, which was wound this morning by Merrick at precisely 7. He asked Merrick to step in. Last night, Poirot said gently, when you checked the doors, did you pass the study? Yes, sir. And the fire? It was burning low, sir. I added a log. Poirot's eyes lit. At what time? Just before 8. Poirot thanked him and dismissed him with a courteous nod. When the door closed, he turned to me. Digitalis acts swiftly, but not instantly. There is nausea, dizziness, and tightening. A man does not sip and die like a candle snuffed. He moved to the hearth and knelt, lifting the edge of the rug. Beneath, pressed flat and overlooked, lay a faint ring of moisture, long since dried. "Brandy glass," I said. "Oui," Poirot replied. Placed there, not dropped. The stain near the rug was allowed to be seen. This one was meant to be hidden. He stood and paced once, then stopped before the desk. He opened the top drawer, which the police had already searched, and removed a slim envelope from beneath a blotter. It was never sealed, he said, and yet it was hidden. Inside was a single sheet, not a confession, not a threat, a copy, a careful copy of a legal document, Sir Lionel's hand unmistakable, altering the terms of a trust. The beneficiary's name had been changed, the date was Christmas Eve, the time noted in the margin later. Poirot closed his eyes for a brief moment as if paying respect to a fallen opponent. The motive, he said quietly, was not anger alone. It was timing. Inspector Dawkins returned then, brisk and satisfied. Poirot handed him the paper. "This," Poirot said, "is why Sir Lionel died when he did. He intended to sign this after the carols. After the guests had gathered. He wished for witnesses. Someone knew, someone could not allow it." Dawkins read, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Crane?" Poirot shook his head. She feared exposure, yes, but she did not know of this document. Only one person did. He tapped the desk once, the person who typed it, the person who placed it beneath the blotter and aligned it so perfectly that only they would think to look. Inspector Dawkins went very still. Poirot smiled, not with triumph, but with certainty. "We are nearly there, Hastings. The clue everyone missed was not hidden. It was waiting patiently for the mind that values order enough to notice when it is disturbed. The revelation did not come with a shout or a dramatic gesture. It arrived quietly, like a door left ajar in a house one thought thoroughly locked." Inspector Dawkins read the document again, slower this time, then once more from the beginning, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less troubling if given the chance. "You're saying," he began carefully, "that Sir Lionel planned to change the trust that very night?" "Precisely," Poirot replied. "Not tomorrow, not after Christmas. That evening, after the carols, when all were present and the act could not later be questioned, and only one person knew of it," Dawkins said slowly. "The secretary, Miss Price." The inspector's gaze lifted at once toward the door. "But she was attacked, nearly killed, which is why she is such a perfect shield," Poirot said softly. "The mind clings to the visible wound and overlooks the quiet hand that guides the blade elsewhere." I stared at him. "You don't believe Mrs. Crane was the true danger, then?" "She was a danger," Poirot corrected gently, "but not the danger. Mrs. Crane feared disgrace. She did not fear loss. There is a difference. They sent for Miss Price at once. She was brought in carefully, pale but composed, a bandage at her temple and a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked smaller than before, as though something essential had been drained from her. "You wish to see me," she said. "Yes, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, drawing out a chair for her with deliberate courtesy. "I wished to thank you." Her eyes flickered. "For what?" "For your restraint," Poirot said, "for many years." Inspector Dawkins frowned. "Miss Price, were you aware of a change to Sir Lionel's trust?" She hesitated only a fraction too long. "I typed many documents for Sir Lionel. That was not my question," Poirot said calmly. "You typed this one." He slid the paper across the table. Her breath caught. "I had no choice," she whispered. He insisted. "Of course," Poirot said. "And you aligned it precisely beneath the blotter. You keep things aligned. It is your nature." Her hands tightened in her lap. "I don't see—" "You saw everything," Poirot interrupted gently. "You saw how Sir Lionel treated his family, how he intended to disinherit Mrs. Crane, how he intended to bind his daughter's future with money and control. And you saw something else." He leaned forward slightly. "You saw that if he signed this document, you would be dismissed. Your usefulness would end." Miss Price closed her eyes. "I gave him the drink," she said quietly. He was angry. He barely tasted it. Inspector Dawkins inhaled sharply. And Mrs. Crane? She argued with him earlier, Miss Price said. I knew she would be suspected. I needed only to let events unfold. And the attack in the conservatory, I asked. Poirot answered before she could. A miscalculation. When she realized the inspector was satisfied, she believed herself safe. Then I spoke of premature death. She knew I was close. She tried to destroy the letter fragment, failed, and when she was confronted, she pretended to be a victim. Miss Price opened her eyes. There were no tears in them, only exhaustion. I did not mean to kill him, she said, but once it was done, I could not undo it. Poirot stood. One always means something, mademoiselle. The little grey cells do not act without reason. Inspector. Dawkins gave the order. As Miss Price was led away, the house seemed to lose its last illusion of safety. Lady Ashcroft wept quietly. Celeste sat very still, staring at the floor, as though seeing a future suddenly unrecognizable. Later, as the police prepared to leave with their prisoner, I joined Poirot by the window. Snow still covered the grounds, pristine and indifferent. You were certain, I said, before the end. Poirot nodded. Because the motive was not passion, Hastings, it was preservation. She killed not to gain, but to remain. Outside, the snow began to fall again, softening the marks left by boots and wheels. Inside Ashcroft Manor, the net of contradictions had finally drawn tight, and the truth, once exposed, could no longer be hidden. The gathering took place in the drawing-room, where the furniture had been restored to its proper symmetry and the fire rebuilt with almost ceremonial care. Poirot insisted upon this. Disorder, he maintained, encouraged emotional excess, and emotional excess blurred the edges of truth. Everyone who could be present was present. Inspector Dawkins stood near the mantelpiece, notebook ready. Lady Ashcroft sat rigidly on the sofa, Celeste beside her, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Major Vale remained standing, his back straight, his expression guarded. Dr. Marr hovered near the window, pale and hollow-eyed. Mrs. Crane sat apart in an armchair, her defiance dulled now into a brittle stillness. Miss Price, escorted in last, was seated where all could see her. Poirot waited until the door closed. Mes amis, he began softly, what we do now is not for drama but for clarity. Christmas Eve is a time for peace, and peace cannot exist where truth is incomplete. He turned first to Lady Ashcroft. Madame, you believed your husband was taken from you by fate, by the cruelty of the season. That belief was encouraged. Lady Ashcroft nodded weakly. I trusted Imogen. She was always so careful, so loyal. Just so, Poirot said, gently. Careful people are often trusted without question. He moved a step, positioning himself so that Miss Price remained within his direct line of sight. Sir Lionel Ashcroft did not die in a moment of passion. He died because time had become his enemy. He intended to sign a document that night, a legal alteration that would have changed several lives. Inspector Dawkins cleared his throat. We've confirmed the document's authenticity. Poirot inclined his head. Merci. Now, let us consider who benefited from stopping that signature. Mrs. Crane feared disgrace, but not immediate loss. Major Vale feared disappointment, but not ruin. Dr. Marr feared suspicion, but not dismissal. Only one person faced the certainty of being removed the moment Sir Lionel's pen touched paper. All eyes shifted, slowly and inevitably, toward Miss Price. She sat very straight, her face composed, but the muscles in her jaw trembled. You typed the document, Poirot continued. You aligned it beneath the blotter. You knew the hour it would be signed. You knew when the study would be empty and when it would not. Celeste's voice broke the silence. Imogen, why? Miss Price did not look at her. Because I built his world, she said quietly, and he would have discarded me like a used envelope. Poirot nodded. You prepared the drink, a measured dose, enough to kill but not enough to cause immediate alarm. You placed the glass so that it would be noticed. You allowed suspicion to drift. And Mrs. Crane? Inspector Dawkins asked. A useful shadow, Poirot replied. Her arguments with Sir Lionel were real. Her temper was known. When she discovered she might be exposed, she acted rashly. That rashness served our murderer perfectly. Poirot turned to Mrs. Crane. You attempted to destroy evidence because you feared scandal, not because you killed. That fear nearly cost Miss Price her disguise. Miss Price closed her eyes. "I didn't plan the attack in the conservatory," she said. "I panicked." "Panic," Poirot said gently, "is the privilege of those who believe themselves safe." Inspector Dawkins stepped forward. "Miss Price, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Lionel Ashcroft." As the constable moved to escort her away, Miss Price finally looked up. Her gaze swept the room once, taking in the faces she had served, managed, corrected. "I kept everything in order," she said softly. "I only wanted to keep my place." Poirot watched her go, his expression neither triumphant nor condemning. When the door closed, the room seemed suddenly larger, emptier. "It is always the same," Poirot said quietly. "Those who believe they hold no power often seek it in the only way they know." He turned toward the window, where the snow had begun to melt, revealing the dark earth beneath. "Truth," he added, "is not cruel. It is only precise." And in that carefully ordered room, with the final deception exposed, silence returned, this time honest and at last deserved. The house did not immediately return to normal once Miss Price had been taken away. Such things rarely happen neatly, no matter how carefully one believes one has arranged life. Voices remained hushed, footsteps tentative, as though the very walls of Ashcroft Manor were listening. Poirot, however, appeared entirely at ease. He stood by the small writing desk in the drawing-room, aligning a stack of papers that no one had disturbed, restoring order where disorder had briefly dared to exist. Lady Ashcroft sat very still, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The shock had not yet worn off, and perhaps it never fully would. Grief, Poirot knew, often arrived late, once the mind was no longer occupied with confusion. Celeste knelt beside her, murmuring words that sounded comforting but carried little meaning. Major Vale had retreated to the window, staring out at the garden as if he might find answers among the bare branches. Dr. Marr paced once, then stopped, his face drawn with exhaustion and relief. In equal measure, Inspector Dawkins closed his notebook. "I'll have my men remain until morning. Statements will need to be finalized." "Of course," Poirot replied politely, "but I think, Inspector, that what remains now is not for the law but for the conscience." Dawkins studied him for a moment, then nodded and stepped away, leaving Poirot alone with the family. Lady Ashcroft lifted her eyes. "I keep wondering how I did not see it," she said faintly. "She was with us for years. She knew everything. That is precisely why you did not see it, madame," Poirot answered gently. "We rarely suspect those who arrange our lives so well that we forget they exist at all." Celeste swallowed. "She was kind to me. She corrected my French. She reminded me of birthdays." Poirot smiled sadly. "And she did all of this sincerely, I believe. People are rarely only one thing. Even those who commit terrible acts often begin with ordinary feelings: fear, pride, the need to matter." Dr. Marr stopped pacing. "Sir Lionel trusted her more than anyone," he said quietly, "perhaps more than he trusted himself." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "and trust, mon ami, is the most dangerous luxury of all." There was a long pause. Outside, a church bell rang somewhere in the distance, its sound softened by the cold night air. Christmas morning was approaching, indifferent to human tragedy. Major Vale turned back into the room. "If you hadn't been here," he said, his voice rough, "we would have blamed one another. Or worse." Poirot inclined his head. "That is why murder is so cruel. It poisons not only the victim but the living." Lady Ashcroft stood slowly, as if the act itself required courage. "You've given us the truth," she said. "I don't know whether to thank you or resent you for it." Poirot met her gaze steadily. "Both are acceptable, madame. Truth is not obliged to comfort." She managed a faint smile. "Will you stay for Christmas breakfast, Monsieur Poirot?" For the first time that night, Poirot hesitated. Then he shook his head. "No, this house must breathe again without me, and I have a train to catch." Later, as he prepared to leave, Celeste accompanied him to the door. "Do you ever regret knowing so much?" she asked softly. Poirot adjusted his coat with meticulous care. "Regret? No, but I am sometimes tired. Human nature, you see, repeats itself endlessly. Only the decorations change. The snow had stopped when Poirot stepped outside. The sky was pale with the promise of dawn. He paused on the steps and looked back once at the quiet house. Inside, the living would grieve, heal, and slowly rebuild. Justice had been served, not with spectacle, but with precision. Poirot smiled faintly to himself and turned down the path, his footsteps measured and unhurried, leaving behind a house that would never again mistake silence for peace. Poirot departed Ashcroft Manor just as the first fragile light of Christmas morning crept across the sky. The cold air was sharp and clean, and the crunch of frost beneath his shoes pleased him immensely. It was, he felt, a sound of order asserting itself after chaos. The driver who had been summoned waited with quiet patience, cap in hand, and opened the door without a word. Poirot paused before entering, allowing himself one final glance at the house. It stood serene now, almost innocent, as though nothing within its walls had ever gone awry. Houses, like people, were excellent at concealment. As the car moved off along the narrow road, Poirot folded his hands neatly atop his walking stick and reflected, not on the cleverness of the solution, but on the simplicity of its cause. Fear. Fear of being displaced. Fear of becoming invisible. It was always fear that loosened the moral stitching first. He had seen it in drawing rooms and boarding houses, in train compartments and grand hotels. Only the costumes changed. At the station, a handful of travellers waited in subdued silence, their breath forming pale clouds in the air. Christmas, Poirot observed, made people introspective. Even the most careless souls seemed momentarily aware of the consequences. He checked his ticket, straightened the crease in his trousers, and settled onto a bench to await the train. From his pocket he withdrew a small notebook, not to write, but simply to hold. The habit comforted him. Lady Ashcroft would endure, he believed. Grief, when paired with truth, eventually found a way to soften. Celeste would grow wiser, perhaps more cautious in her affections. Major Vale would return to his routines, carrying the quiet burden of what might have been. Dr. Marr would sleep better, his conscience no longer whispering unanswered questions, and Miss Price, Miss Price, would sit alone with her thoughts, confronted at last by the cost of believing oneself indispensable. The whistle of the approaching train cut through the morning stillness. Poirot rose, immaculate as ever, and boarded with unhurried grace. As the carriage warmed and the landscape began to slide past the window, he allowed himself a small sigh of satisfaction. Not pride, never pride, but relief. The little grey cells had done their duty. Across the aisle, a young couple spoke in low voices, hands entwined, their faces hopeful. Poirot smiled faintly. Life, for all its shadows, continued to insist upon itself. He removed his hat and placed it carefully on his knees, aligning it just so, and closed his eyes for a moment of rest. Justice, he knew, was not always accompanied by joy. Sometimes it arrived quietly, leaving behind only clarity and a lingering sadness. But clarity was enough. Without it, the world slipped too easily into comforting lies. As the train gathered speed, Poirot opened his eyes and gazed once more at the winter countryside. Somewhere behind him, a crime had ended, a mystery resolved, and a family began the slow work of healing. Somewhere ahead, another puzzle waited, another tangle of human motives yearning to be understood. Poirot adjusted his moustache with habitual care and permitted himself a gentle smile. Christmas, after all, was a season of revelations, some divine, some painfully human. And as long as people continued to deceive themselves and one another, there would always be work for a small Belgian detective who believed, above all else, in the quiet, uncompromising power of truth.